Hello, everyone, and namaskar. So, today's podcast is a continuation of the reading of the book titled Ananda Marga Elementary Philosophy. And this is the second part to the chapter titled What is this world? The crudest stage in the creation is Chiti Tattva, where consciousness exists as an inanimate object. Thus, in the process of creation, the more consciousness moves towards crudeness, the smaller is the reflection of cosmic consciousness. And when it moves from crude to subtle, the reflection of cosmic consciousness is correspondingly greater. As consciousness is fully reflected in humans, this shows that on its return journey from crude to subtle, consciousness has made humans its final abode, from whence it can merge in cosmic consciousness. Creation is only a thought wave of Saguna Brahma, the final stage of creation. The human being is then naturally the ultimate stage of the thought wave. Thus, humans are the highest evolved beings and are the ultimate stage in the evolution of life. The crude universe is formed as a result of the psychic survey of the qualified supreme entity, Saguna Brahma. And humans appear at the last stage of this survey, while Vyoma Tattva, ethereal factor, forms the first. In creation, besides millions of human beings, we also find animals, plants, and matter in the five fundamental factors of Chiti, solid, Apa, liquid, Agni, luminous, Vayu, aerial, and Vyoma, ethereal. Humans, who form the last stage in the thought wave of Brahma today, must have, at the earliest stage, also existed as the first stage or Vyoma Tattva. They must have, in the course of the thought wave, evolved to the next stage of Vayu Tattva. But the first stage of Vyoma Tattva could not have disappeared altogether, because air or Vayu Tattva cannot exist without the presence of ether or empty space. Even when the first stage of the thought wave evolves to the second stage, Vyoma Tattva or ether continues to exist. The question about the replacement of Vyoma Tattva, which has already passed on as the second stage of the thought wave, arises here. There is only one possibility, and that is that Brahma again takes up the form of Vyoma Tattva. Vyoma Tattva would have completely disappeared from existence in the course of creation if it were not replenished. Just as when the students are promoted from class 1 to class 2, class 1 would remain vacant unless fresh students were admitted. And when the students of class 2 are promoted to class 3, they are replaced by promotions from class 1, where fresh admissions are again made. This also applies to the thought waves of Brahma. When Vyoma Tattva, ethereal factor, gets converted into Vayu Tattva, and Vayu Tattva becomes Agni, the vacancy created by the formation of Vayu from Vyoma is filled by Brahma, creating more Vyoma Tattva in its thought waves. The student who joins class 1 earlier will obtain his degree sooner. Similarly, unit consciousness, which formed the first stage of the thought wave of Brahma as primitive protozoa, will, after passing from subtle to crude and then from crude to subtle, develop as humans at the earliest moment. The speck of dust, which has an intermediary state in evolution, lies as an inanimate object today, will also someday be transformed into humans. As Saguna Brahma is subtle, and creation moves from subtle to crude, and then again from crude to subtle, this shows that creation is formed out of it and again marches back to it. Purusha is subtle by nature. It is due to the maximum influence of Prakrti that Purusha becomes the crudest in Chiti Tattva. When the influence of Prakrti is greater, Purusha becomes cruder, and when that influence is less, he is more subtle. This is the reason that Purusha becomes inanimate, Jada, in Chiti Tattva, where the application of the qualifying principles of Prakrti has reached its climax. After this phase, creation again marches towards the subtle from its crude form, and as a result, its closeness to non-qualified Purusha also slowly develops. The development shows the gradual release of Purusha from the influence of Prakrti. Unless Purusha is freed from the influence of Prakrti, his return to the non-qualified state is not possible. Thus, we find that as creation moves from crude to subtle, Purusha gradually becomes free from the qualifying influence of Prakrti. Purusha is gradually becoming free from the bondage of the influence of Prakrti in the movement of creation from crude to subtle. While in the other phase of creation, he is gradually falling more and more under the influence of Prakrti as creation moves from subtle to crude. He finally becomes inanimate, jada, in the form of Chiti Tattva, under the extreme influence of the qualifying principle of Prakrti. The property of Prakrti is to qualify Purusha. In the phase of creation, where the subtle changes into crude, we find that Prakrti gradually qualifies Purusha, as a result of which he is deprived of his capacity to reflect cosmic consciousness, until he appears completely devoid of consciousness and lies as an inanimate object in the form of Chiti Tattva. In the movement from subtle to crude, Prakrti exercises her qualifying property to the fullest. But in the other phase of creation, when the movement is from crude to subtle, we find that gradually the reflection of consciousness becomes clear. In other words, Purusha is gradually becoming free from the influence of Prakrti. In this phase of creation, Prakrti is not able to exercise her binding quality properly, because Purusha, instead of coming further under her influence, is becoming free as a result. How Purusha is able to free himself of the influence of Prakrti when her nature or property is to qualify and influence Purusha needs explanation. Under the influence of the qualifying principle of Prakrti, Bhuma Chaitanya, or cosmic consciousness, has manifested himself as an infinite number of unit consciousnesses in the creation. It is only some of these unit consciousnesses which have taken the form of Chiti Tattva, and these are gradually being freed from the influence of Prakrti in the movement of creation from crude to subtle. The entire creation has its origin in Saguna Brahma, and so the Supreme Entity is the cause of the transformation of unit consciousness into this crude creation, and also of its freedom from the qualifying force. It is Saguna Brahma who is responsible for this. Saguna Brahma himself must be emancipated if he is consciousness. One who is in fetters himself cannot release others from them. If Rama and Shyama have both been locked up, Rama will never be able to get Shyama released as long as he is himself imprisoned. Rama cannot accomplish this from inside the prison, no matter how hard he tries. Rama can never be the instrument of Shyama's release. But someone who is outside the prison could free Shyama, even with only a little effort. He could become the cause of his release. Those who are not free themselves cannot become the means of freeing others. Hence, if Saguna Brahma is to be the cause of the emancipation of unit consciousness, he must be someone who has himself achieved emancipation, Mukta Purusha. What is meant by Mukta Purusha? In Nirguna Brahma, both Prakrti and Purusha are independent. There, Purusha, on account of his independence, is not qualified by the qualifying principle of Prakrti, and he is Purusha of Nirguna Brahma. He becomes the Purusha of Nirguna Brahma only on attaining freedom from the influence of Prakrti. Thus, one who has attained Nirguna Brahma by means of sadhana, intuitional practices, is Mukta Purusha. On attaining the Nirguna stage, one becomes free from the bondage of the principles of Prakrti. Yet, if such persons come under the influence of Prakrti by their own will for a predetermined period with the intention of liberating others, they will still be Mukta Purusha. They have not been bound by the influence of Prakrti. They have themselves accepted the qualifying influence of Prakrti for a certain period. Prakrti will not be able to keep them under her influence after the completion of that period. Hence, a person who has attained the Nirguna stage through his or her sadhana and who comes under the influence of Prakrti for a certain period, at his or her own instance, with the object of the liberation of humanity, is a Mukta Purusha. A Mukta Purusha cannot be the cause of the bondage of others. Here, bondage means being qualified by the principle of Prakrti. To be the cause of the bondage of others would mean coming under the influence of Prakrti. For binding others would not be possible without being qualified by Prakrti. As Mukta Purushas are free from the bondage of Prakrti, they cannot be influenced by her, and so they can never be the cause of the bondage of others. As Saguna Brahma is Mukta Purusha, it also cannot be the cause of the bondage of others. In the course of creation, we find, however, that the vast universe came into being according to the will of Saguna Brahma, when every unit consciousness came under the influence of Prakrti. Saguna Brahma, being Mukta Purusha, means that it itself is Mukta, emancipated, but all its units are not free individually and have come under the control of Prakrti at the instance of Saguna Brahma. Thus, Saguna Brahma becomes the cause of bondage of unit consciousness, and itself becomes bound. But we have already concluded that Saguna Brahma is Mukta Purusha. If that is the case, then why should all its units come under the influence of Prakrti? And why should this universe be created at all? While explaining Mukta Purusha, it was said earlier that those who, after attaining the Nirguna state, accept the influence of Prakrti by their own will for a fixed period with the object of helping others, are Mukta, emancipated. As a Mukta Purusha, Saguna Brahma has to accept the influence of Prakrti for a certain period after attaining the Nirguna stage, with the object of serving living beings, jivas. Every unit consciousness has its origin in Saguna Brahma, and it is with the object of assisting them that Saguna Brahma has freely accepted the bondage of Prakrti for a certain period. The greatest service to unit consciousness is to take it back to the supreme state where Prakrti has no influence. Hence, the welfare of Purusha lies in his being liberated from the bondage of Prakrti so that he can attain the supreme state. Saguna Brahma thus accepts the influence of Prakrti for a certain period of time with the sole aim of also attaining the status of Mukta Purusha for every one of his unit consciousnesses. It is with this aim in view that every unit consciousness comes under the influence of Prakrti at her instance. If the emancipation of every unit consciousness is the objective, the period for which Saguna Brahma accepts the influence of Prakrti will have to last until every unit consciousness is freed from bondage, or until each of them attains the status of Mukta Purusha, like Saguna Brahma. As Saguna Brahma wants each of its units to become free like itself, a Mukta Purusha, it will have to form itself into an infinite number of units in order to fulfill its desire to liberate all of them. Anu, or unit, becomes the minutest part or the smallest unit. In order to divide itself into units, Saguna Brahma had to take a crude form because it is not possible to divide a subtle thing. For instance, fire, which is a particular form of Tejas Tattva, luminous factor, is more subtle than earth or Chiti Tattva. Can this be divided or split into two? Striking two matches separately will produce two flames, but if those two sticks are held close together, there will only be one flame, and to distinguish between the flames produced by the two sticks will be impossible. In spite of all our efforts, we will not be able to draw a line of demarcation between the flames produced by the two sticks. The flames lose their individual identity to become one object or a single entity. Thus, it is not possible to divide or separate fire. But if two handfuls of dust are mixed together, it is possible to divide them into two distinct parts again. Thus, unlike fire, earth can be divided into parts. Fire is more subtle than earth, but is cruder than ether or air. As it is not possible to divide fire, the question of dividing air, ether, or cosmic consciousness, Brahma Chaitanya, Bhuma Chaitanya, which are far more subtle, does not arise. It is not possible to divide water or ether because, in spite of our efforts, it is not possible to discern a line of demarcation between the different parts of water. It is only earth, or Chiti Tattva, the crudest rudimental factor, which can be divided properly into desired, distinct units. Saguna Brahma had to assume a crude form so that it could divide itself into innumerable units. It exists as units only in Chiti Tattva, solid factor, as it cannot divide itself into units in any other form. It can also be said that the crude universe came into being, or the face of creation, which advances from subtle to crude, was introduced only with the intention of forming infinite multiplicities of the innumerable unit consciousnesses. It is only in Chiti Tattva that unit consciousness comes into being. Saguna Brahma wants every one of its unit consciousnesses to be emancipated, and for this purpose, just as it has its own instance assumed the crudest form as Chiti Tattva under the extreme influence of the qualifying principle of Prakrti, so again does it at its own instance advance towards subtlety in order to gradually free itself of the bondage. For Chaitanya, or consciousness, freedom from the bondage of Prakrti means the development of subtlety, and finally, its return to the non-qualified supreme entity. The face of creation, where it moves from subtle to crude, has the purpose of cosmic consciousness forming itself into its infinite multiplicities as unit consciousnesses. The next phase of the movement, from crude to subtle, has the intention of liberating the unit consciousnesses from the bondage of Prakrti. Saguna Brahma aims at the liberation of each of its units, and to fulfill this purpose, it has to manifest itself as the creation, which advances from subtle to crude and then from crude to subtle in its two phases. Thus, the purpose or object of Saguna Brahma in creating this universe is to obtain freedom for each of its units, or for all its multiplicities, and to obtain for them the status of Mukta Purusha. To become Mukta Purusha, attainment of Nirguna Brahma is essential. The desire of Saguna Brahma to liberate each of its units will only be fulfilled when every unit consciousness attains Nirguna Brahma at the instance of Saguna Brahma. The possibility or the capacity of Saguna Brahma to obtain for its unit consciousnesses the attainment of Nirguna has to be examined. Creation is only a psychic survey, or kalpana, of Saguna Brahma. Hence, it is in the thought waves of Saguna Brahma that it forms an infinite number of unit consciousnesses in Chiti Tattva. Psychic survey, kalpana, or thought waves are only functions of mind, and their activities depend on the limitations of the mind creating them. It is just like the thought wave creating Chauringi in the mind of Rama. It is confined within the limits of Rama's mind, and Shyama's mind cannot see it. If Kalpana, or psychic survey, is confined within the limits of the mind creating it, the unit consciousness also, which exists within the expanse of a thought wave of Saguna Brahma, has to be confined within the limits of the mind of Saguna Brahma. Unit consciousness cannot thus go beyond the mind of the qualified supreme entity. Nirguna Brahma is beyond the scope of the mind of Saguna, and so all the units of Saguna Brahma cannot attain Nirguna Brahma even if he wishes. The purpose of Saguna Brahma, to liberate and make every one of his units a Mukta Purusha like himself, is not served and becomes meaningless if every unit consciousness cannot attain Nirguna Brahma if he desires it. We must see what Saguna Brahma then does to achieve its object. Brahma is without any beginning, and so is Prakrti. When Purusha consciousness is less condensed, Prakrti qualifying principle qualifies Purusha, and Brahma is then called Saguna Brahma, or the qualified supreme entity. If Brahma is eternal, the less condensed Purusha in it must also have existed throughout eternity. The qualifying influence of Prakrti must have also been operating over Purusha for eternity. Saguna Brahma has thus been a qualified entity since eternity, because Prakrti has been influencing the less condensed Brahma for eternity. But earlier we saw that Saguna Brahma is a Mukta Purusha. This shows that Saguna Brahma, which was formerly in bondage, later became emancipated. Here, however, a question arises about the agency which brings about the emancipation of Purusha from the influence of Prakrti. There is no other entity except Prakrti, and Purusha has been under the influence of Prakrti throughout eternity. In the absence of a third entity, and as Purusha is under the influence of Prakrti, the only course possible for his liberation is through his own desire and effort. The effort to liberate oneself from the influence of Prakrti is called sadhana. Before Saguna Brahma became free from bondage, it was called Prajapati. And after it attained emancipation by sadhana and became Mukta Purusha, it was called Hiranyagarbha. Saguna Brahma wants, but is not able to obtain the Nirguna state for unit consciousnesses, or unit Purushas, and its object is not realized. The object of Saguna Brahma could only be realized if unit consciousnesses attain Nirguna Brahma by carrying out sadhana, like Prajapati. Sadhana means an earnest effort or an effort with intense longing. Sadhana for mukti, emancipation, means to make an earnest effort with an intense desire for liberation from the bondage of the qualifying principles of Prakrti. The effort with an intense desire to liberate itself from the bondage of Prakrti will only bring results if unit consciousness is alive to its subservient position and understands its bondage to the qualifying principles of Prakrti. The question of emancipation does not arise for one who does not realize his or her bondage and dependence. Hence, for liberation, it is necessary to be aware that one is in bondage. It is only after one realizes this that one feels the necessity to search for a method for one's liberation. Both the realization of being in bondage and a methodical effort to obtain liberation are required by unit consciousness for attaining emancipation. Units should also be so developed that they become aware of their bondage and are able to find the means to free themselves from this bondage. In Chiti Tattva, units are inanimate when they come into being. That inanimate Jada unit being, under the extreme influence of Prakrti, is incapable of even realizing its existence and will never be able to find the means of its emancipation. Saguna Brahma aims at the liberation of every one of its units, but is not able to achieve this completely in the case of Jada. Saguna Brahma, therefore, liberates them from the influence of Prakrti as far as it is possible according to its capacity. This is the reason for humans possessing clearly reflected consciousness, as they form the final stage of creation. In humans, the expansion is not complete, and they are unable to get absolute release from the bondage of the qualifying principles of Prakrti. But consciousness in humans is clearly reflected, and they are able to realize their subjugation. This also gives them the capacity to make an effort to perform sadhana for their emancipation. It was with the intention of creating humans capable of performing sadhana that Saguna Brahma came under the influence of Prakrti and brought this creation into being. So humans were created only to do sadhana and attain emancipation. Those who do not perform sadhana for their mukti, emancipation, even though they were created for this purpose, go against the wishes of the Supreme Entity. They defeat the very purpose of the creation of human beings. Consciousness in humans is a reflection on the mental plate, needing an adhara, or body made of the 5 rudimental factors, originating from Saguna Brahma. But the cosmic consciousness is not dependent on any adhara or body. Saguna Brahma, or the qualified Supreme Entity, has no body like that of a human being. Humans are a thought projection of Saguna Brahma and exist within its mind. Saguna Brahma could also have had a body like a human if it had existed within the mind of another entity and come into being as its thought projection. Saguna Brahma is non-causal. It has no beginning and no end. As such, it cannot exist in the mind of another entity and acquire a body. Consciousness, in humans, is only a reflection of cosmic consciousness, while the consciousness of Saguna Brahma is cosmic consciousness itself. Humans also receive antakarana, introversial psychic force, like Saguna Brahma. But a human being's mind is only a unit of the cosmic mind of Saguna Brahma, just as his or her consciousness is only a multiplicity of cosmic consciousness. Humans can also create their thought waves in the same way as Saguna Brahma created the universe in its thought waves. We saw earlier that Rama's capacity to create Chauringi in his imagination or thought waves while sitting in Bhagalpur is only momentary and appears real only to him. On the other hand, Saguna Brahma's creation of the universe appears real and is not momentary. This is so because humans, being a part of its creation, formed as a thought projection of Saguna Brahma, have a relative existence together with the rest of creation. The cosmos or Saguna Brahma looks upon its thought projection as real, and the unit within naturally has to feel it as real. Humans, therefore, consider the thought projection of the qualified supreme entity and its creation, the universe, to be a reality. While Rama's mind and its projection and imagination is limited, within which Shyama's mind does not work. The imagined objects formed in Rama's mind can be seen and considered real by him only for the time the spell of his imagination lasts. Shyama's mind does not exist within Rama's mind, and hence the former does not find these objects real. Had Shyama's mind existed within Rama's mind, the former would have seen Chauringi created in the thought waves of the latter's mind, and like Rama, would have also considered the imaginary creation of Chauringi to be factual. For instance, we have seen earlier that a person can extend or project his or her mind to bring the minds of others within its scope. At that time, others also see that person's imagination and consider it to be real, like the magician's rope trick. Thus, human beings can also create objects in their thought waves, but they are only replicas of their previous experience. They must see or hear about the object which they create in their imagination. As Brahma is non-causal, nothing existed before or beyond it to enable it to copy any object in its thought waves. Hence, the thought projections of Brahma are always new. They are not and cannot be based on past experience like the imagination of human beings. The last and most important difference between Brahma and human beings is the difference in their characteristic property, or dharma. The dharma of human beings is to do sadhana and become a mukta Purusha, emancipated being, while that of Saguna Brahma is to provide an opportunity to each and every one of its units to become a mukta Purusha. In fact, all the effort and trouble of the qualified supreme entity in creating the universe and the human beings in it is directed only towards the purpose of emancipating every one of its units. Thank you.